Hopefully you're having a good day out there. And if you're not having a good day, I hope that it gets better soon. Hopefully your caffeine is strong. I feel like every time I open social media or watch the news or read any of the new Senate bill updates right now, especially for Ohio, the history of America and the history of minorities and anyone even remotely marginalized in any way, I feel like their voices and their history is just very quickly and very quietly being erased. Even down to the tiny little details that, again, everyone always says it's insignificant and it doesn't matter, but that is where it starts. Google removing any Heritage Month entries in our calendar, saying, it wasn't sustainable. Okay. If it's sustainable to put President's Day and Christmas Day and whatever the name of your taxes are due on April 15th, if it's sustainable of a model to put that in all of our calendars every single year, it's also sustainable enough to put Black History Month or Pride Month or any other heritage month, right? I feel like that's just an absolute excuse. It's insane. But especially, we're seeing all of these posts about, the Constitution was pulled from the whitehouse.gov website, or, the women's history section was pulled from the NASA website, and all of these things where they're pulling these full interviews, documents, articles, everything concerning some of these buzzwords that we have to delete. Everything's online and digital now, right? So it's just very, very easy to literally and metaphorically delete history and voices and stories. And then if we aren't careful, because again, we've read this story before. We've read Animal Farm. We've read Fahrenheit 451. We've read To Kill a Mockingbird. We've read The Hunger Games. We've read The Handmaid's Tale. All of these stories, I feel like, are authors trying to warn us. Or it's The Book Thief. It's stories about the Holocaust where it's historical, right? It is nonfiction. This is what happened. This was the history. And I think the farther we get away from history, the easier it is to forget. The more removed we are from the people who were harmed, the easier it is for us to sort of displace the responsibility, the diffusion of responsibility from that mob mentality where, that was someone else. It didn't really affect me. And did it even happen? Was it really that bad? Was it really? Did that many people actually die? Maybe it was just elaboration, right? That's the dangerousness of this situation when you're censoring and deleting people's stories, is if we aren't careful, it will just cease to exist. And with the removal of minority voices and every aspect of DE&I across the country, I think it's more critical than ever to tell these stories and to keep history fresh in our memories so we don't keep repeating it. And so as we celebrate Black History Month, I think it's so important to remember all of the stories, good and the bad. I don't want to only focus on the negatives because I do think the world is already negative enough. However, I think also with Black History Month, and anytime we're talking about difficult, uncomfortable discussions like this, it's really, really easy to only focus on the positive, lighthearted, upbeat stories because those are comfier. But I think there's a big danger in avoiding the difficult discussions as well, right? And so this episode, I have 3 stories that I found, and they are pretty heavy. They are pretty negative. But you know what? It's also history. And it may or may not be repeating itself. And so I think it's important that we hear it. I think it's important to remember all of the stories, good and bad. And these stories are also ones that personally I feel like are not discussed enough. I never saw these on the news. It doesn't seem like they were taught in school. Anytime I need to get a good vibe check or a feel for generalized across the country educational backgrounds, I always ask some of my friends from California, and like my husband Daniel, who obviously grew up and was raised in California the whole time, because we know this, right? California and the California educational system is one of the most liberal in the country. And so that means that they are going to showcase the widest range of histories and stories. They are going to include the most diverse voices and stories. And so I feel like if they're not teaching some of these stories and histories in the California schools, then they sure aren't teaching them in Minnesota, in Oklahoma, in Mississippi, in North Dakota, like some of these just more rural, Midwest, conservative Bible Belt states, if they're not even teaching it in California, right? So also, unfortunately, like I said, these stories, I'm worried that they're going to repeat themselves. And I think you'll see the similarities in all three of these stories, despite the time difference, which tells you that while we have made great progress, we aren't where we need to be in the country yet. Racial inequalities are obviously still a problem. So let's go in chronological order, and we will start with the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. It was one of the most significant events in Tulsa's history. Following World War I, Tulsa, Oklahoma was recognized nationally for its affluent African American community known as the Greenwood District. The thriving business district and surrounding residential area was referred to as Black Wall Street. In June 1921, a series of events nearly destroyed the entire Greenwood area. The Tulsa Historical Society Museum website, it's so cool. I think I've geeked out about websites before in one of the past episodes, but it's just one of those where it's just fascinating layout. You guys honestly should check it out. It's got so many pictures and court case documents from this time frame in this massacre. They have audio files of interviews with people that were present or family members, whatever. Highly recommend checking it out if you've got the time. I will also share some snippets to the podcast Instagram page, but let's get right into the details. So on the morning of May 30th, 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland was riding in the elevator in the Drexel building at 3rd and Main with a white woman named Sarah Page. I'm going to pause there because I think we all know where this is going, unfortunately. And I hate the fact that you can read one sentence and you already know, yep, that's what happened. Yep, that's, again, we've all read To Kill a Mockingbird, right? So the details of what followed vary from person to person. Accounts of an incident circulated among the city's white community during the day and became more exaggerated with each telling. Tulsa police arrested Rowland the following day and began an investigation after a very inflammatory report in the May 31 edition of their Tulsa Tribune. There was a confrontation between black and white armed mobs around the courthouse where the sheriff and his men had barricaded the top floor to protect Rowland. Shots were fired and the outnumbered African Americans began retreating to the Greenwood District. In the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, Greenwood was looted and burned by white rioters. Governor Robertson declared martial law. The National Guard came in. The National Guard were assisting the firemen in putting out fires, took African Americans out of the hands of vigilantes, and imprisoned all black Tulsans not already interned. Over 6,000 people were held at the convention hall and the fairgrounds, some for as long as 8 days. 24 hours after the violence erupted, it ceased. In the wake of the violence, 35 city blocks lay in charred ruins. More than 800 people were treated for injuries, and contemporary reports of deaths began at 36. But as I'll talk about this in a second, but as historians were digging in more, they now believe as many as 300 people more than likely were killed. And so, again, we've all read To Kill a Mockingbird. We can all kind of piece together the political climate at that time, the tensions, the racial tensions. It sucks because the black community had every reason to believe that Dick Rowland would have 1,000% been lynched after his arrest, right? Like, no doubt, I think in any of my listeners' minds right now, like, realistically, that is what would have happened, regardless of the truth, regardless of what actually happened in that elevator. Unfortunately, at that time in our country, he would have been killed. 1,000%. He would have been lynched. And so, his story, Sarah Page's story, the unknown gunman we don't know who started the shots, right? They were all just sparks that ignited a long smoldering fire. So in 2001, an official Race Riot Commission was organized to review the details of the event. And again, this is all from the Tulsa Historical Museum and Society website. No one will ever know the absolute truth of what happened during the hours of the race massacre, but by examining historical resources, members of the Race Riot Commission determined a number of details to be undeniable. Quote, "These are not myths, not rumors, not speculations, not questioned. They are historical record," unquote. So this commission report goes on to say Jim Crow, jealousy, white supremacy, and land lust all played roles in leading up to the destruction and loss of life on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. Although Dick Rowland's charges were later dismissed and highly suspect from the start, the Black community had cause to believe that his personal safety, like the defense of themselves and their community, depended on them alone. As hostile groups gathered and their confrontation worsened, municipal and county authorities failed to take action to calm or contain the situation. At the eruption of violence, civil officials selected many men, all of them white and some of them participants in that violence, and made those men their agents as deputies. In that capacity, deputies did not stem the violence but added to it, often through overt acts that were themselves illegal. Public officials provided firearms and ammunition to individuals, again all of them white. Units of the Oklahoma National Guard participated in the mass arrests of all or nearly all of Greenwood's residents. They removed them to other parts of the city and detained them in holding centers. Entering the Greenwood district, people stole, damaged, or destroyed personal property left behind in homes and businesses. People, some of them agents of government, also deliberately burned or otherwise destroyed homes credibly estimated to have numbered 1,256, along with virtually every other structure, including churches, schools, businesses, even a hospital and library in that Greenwood district. Despite duties to preserve order and to protect property, no government at any level offered adequate resistance, if any at all, to what amounted to the destruction of the Greenwood neighborhood. Although the exact total can never be determined, credible evidence makes it probable that many people, likely numbering between 100 to 300, were killed during the massacre. Not one of these criminal acts was then or ever has been prosecuted or punished by government at any level, municipal, county, state, or federal. Even after the restoration of order, it was official policy to release a Black detainee only upon the application of a white person, and then only if that white person agreed to accept responsibility for that detainee's subsequent behavior. As private citizens, many whites in Tulsa and neighboring communities did extend invaluable assistance to the massacre's victims, and the relief efforts of the American Red Cross in particular provided a model of human behavior at its best. Now, this I feel like is just insult to injury, but in recent years, apparently, there's been an ongoing discussion about what to call this event. Historically, it had always been called the Tulsa Race Riot. Some say it was given that name at the time for insurance purposes because designating it a riot prevented insurance companies from having to pay benefits to the people of Greenwood, whose homes and businesses were destroyed. It also was common at that time for any large-scale clash between different racial or ethnic groups to be categorized a race riot. But I pulled up the definitions of a riot versus a massacre, and you tell me what you think it should be. So, definition of a riot: a tumultuous disturbance of the public peace by 3 or more persons assembled together and acting with common intent. Definition of a massacre is the act or an instance of killing a number of usually helpless or unresisting human beings under circumstances of atrocity or cruelty. So, Hannibal B. Johnson with the city of Tulsa is doing another type of investigation, article, documentation type deal on that website. But the Tulsa mayor, G.T. Binham, launched an investigation into long-standing oral history accounts of mass graves at various sites in Tulsa, allegedly burial sites for dozens of mostly Black victims of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre exist, but they don't really know somehow. They don't know for sure. So Mayor Binham continues to emphasize that this process, which may be long and tedious, is an investigation. There's, quote, "There is no certainty that one or more mass graves will be located. The investigation is geared towards answering as best we can the lingering historical question originating through oral histories about the existence of one or more mass graves linked to the massacre. By this undertaking, we honor our oral history and its tellers. This history, separate and apart from its truth, has value," unquote. Now, keep those mass graves in the back of your mind because they do come up again. That's all I'll say. This next story is from our old stomping grounds at Travis Air Force Base in California. This article was put out on the Travis website November 8th, 2013. And it talks about how the Equal Opportunity Office, EO, was created because of the race riots that happened there back in 1971. The author says, quote, "In extreme cases, these problems," meaning race relations, "can proliferate outside the individual workplace and harm an entire base. The race riots of 1971 here are a prime example of what can happen when workplace equality concerns are ignored," unquote. On May 25th, 1971, Travis experienced a weekend of disturbances with racial overtones. Altercations in the 1300 barracks area and the enlisted club led to violence. A blaze started on the top floor of a transient barracks in the bachelor office quarters area. Eventually, there were 135 arrests, 10 people were injured, and a civilian firefighter died. According to the Oakland Tribune, it started when a white airman was kicked by a black airman in a barracks fight. Then that Sunday, 2 black airmen were arrested for fighting with white airmen, and by Monday, tensions had grown stronger, right? Then there was a fight in the mess hall, followed by a march of black airmen to the base blockade to, quote, "free our brothers," unquote. Groups of 50 to 75 airmen formed and were involved in several confrontations. They were turned away by 300 military police near a base softball field, at which point the base called for help from civilian police. The group turned and assaulted players on the softball field, obtaining several baseball bats they later used in assaults against individuals and privately owned vehicles. Groups entered base housing where they caused more damage. Another group was gathered at the Snake Pit, the 60th Field Maintenance Group's snack bar, where Colonel Ivor Vollmer, the group's commander, was dragged from his car and beaten. Later that night is when the fire broke out in the quarters where James Tyson Mooresberger, 47 of Napa, he died of a heart attack fighting the fire. Today, the 60th EO office works to prevent hostile work environments by encouraging communication among all ranks, saying, quote, "It is vital to successful communication regardless of inter-office hierarchy." And here, Mark Wilderman, the 60th Air Mobility Wing historian, said, quote, "It's hard to put different people together. You get someone from the city and put them with someone from an impoverished area who are being drafted into the military at this time and don't really want to be there anyway. It spells trouble," unquote. I want to pause there for a second and say that is such trash. He does not speak for us. That is wild. That's so like uneducated to say, and I'm trying to be nice here is what I'm trying to do. Sounds like he was from a different generation, right? You know what? Well, I'm going to be a bigger person today. I'm going to be a decent human being. I'm going to show a little self-control. We're going to move on. We don't believe that, okay? We don't believe that in the Air Force. moving on, the article goes on to say it is events such as this that have shaped the Air Force we are in now. And that I do agree with, right? These events, yes, it was only one weekend on one base, but you know what? That is part of the history, and that does shape who we are as a military now. And a better quote from our military force, First Lieutenant Jillian Saridaki, the 60th EO Deputy Director, from a 2012 interview, she said, quote, "One of the biggest benefits we have in the military is how diverse we are. The more education the EO office is able to provide about that diversity, the stronger our overall force can become," unquote. That's, I think, what Mark Wilderman was trying to say, okay? That's what he should have said. I want to let those words sink in a little bit now, considering our current climate. I don't understand why we feel so threatened by DEI. Like, why do we feel like our identities will be stripped from us if we celebrate other people's identities? If we celebrate other people's cultures, their heritage, their background, their upbringing, that doesn't take away from what you have accomplished, from your upbringing, from your heritage, from your cultural identity, from what you bring to the table. It's not an either or. I also hate that DEI becomes pro or anti-Black because it's so much more than African Americans. There's a bajillion other communities and groups of people that benefit from DEI, like working moms that have to pump or that have kids in daycare, like veterans, like women, like so many different people that DEI is meant to help and support. And I just, again, not at the expense of others though. And so I think, I don't know, I don't get why people are so threatened by it. Like, they feel they will have their rights and their privileges taken away by us giving an equal shot, or as close to an equal shot as we can, to marginalized people. I don't know. I can't wrap my head around that. But this last story, moving right along chronologically, we had the massacre, the Tulsa Massacre in 1921. We had these race riots at Travis, 1971. Now, this last story, this breaks my heart. So, I saw a video about this and I was like, no shot, this is real. No shot, this is real. And I looked into it and of course it was real. So I read this article published by NPR on January 12th, 2024. Families of people who were buried in a pauper's field next to the Hines County Penal Farm near Jackson, Mississippi, are calling for a federal investigation into the burials, which took place without families being notified. With their attorney now saying the field holds hundreds more graves, the families want a full accounting of the bodies buried there. So this issue, according to this article, it became national news last fall. Again, I never saw anything about it, but so I don't know if they got like a one-day special or what. But that was when several families said they had waited months to hear about a missing loved one, only to learn their relative had died months earlier and were buried in a grassy field, their graves marked only by a metal tag bearing a number. Their attorney, civil rights lawyer Ben Crump, says he believes many more people were buried under similar circumstances. Quote, "We know, based on the records from the coroner's office, that since 2016, in the last 8 years, we can identify 215 individuals that were buried behind that jail, and their families have not been notified," unquote. And that's what Crump told PBS NewsHour the week of January 2024. So last October, Betterson Wade told NBC News the anguishing story of how months after she filed a missing persons report about her son, Dexter Wade, she was finally told that her son was dead at age 37. The police also told her that county officials had buried him in the local pauper's field, she said. Police investigators said that Dexter Wade had been struck and killed by an SUV driven by an off-duty Jackson Police Department officer just hours after his mother had last seen him. Quote, the accident was investigated and it was determined that it was in fact an accident and that there was no malicious intent, unquote. That was said by Mayor Chokwe Lumumba. But Lumumba added officials had failed to inform the Wade family. Quote, there was a lack of communication with the Missing Persons Division, the coroner's office, and the police department's accident investigation unit, he said. By the time Betterson Wade learned her son's fate, she had spent months looking for him, contacting police in Jackson, giving them potential leads, and asking for any updates about where her son might be. She also had asked for help on social media to find him. Turned out that Dexter Wade had a prescription medicine bottle with his name on it in his pocket when he died. Within days of his death, the Hinds County Coroner's Office was able to confirm his identity and share that information with police, but somehow Jackson police were unable to inform Wade's mother until last August. Quote, the fact that Dexter had a state identification card and several other identifying items shows us that there was a concerted effort to keep the truth and manner of his death from his family. Quote, that was said by Crump, according to the member station Mississippi Public Broadcasting. Quote, there is no excuse, not even incompetence, for not notifying a next of kin of an identified man's death. Unquote. At least 2 other families are known to have been informed they have relatives buried in the field. In the case of a man named Mario Moore, aged 40, the lag in communication was compounded by another issue, the Jackson Police Department's initial failure to disclose more than 20 homicides that took place over the course of 2023. In October, when the agency finally released the names of people who had been killed, Moore's family was shocked to see his name on the list, and to learn that he had been killed on February 2nd and buried in the same field as Dexter Wade. Hinds County officials had informed Betterson Wade that her son's body would be exhumed and transferred to a funeral home on November 13th in a process that would begin at 11:30 a.m. And this part's so heartbreaking. After months of uncertainty, the event promised a moment of closure, understandably, but as Mississippi Public Broadcasting reported, when Wade arrived at the field, she learned her son's body had already been dug up hours earlier at 8 a.m. Quote, as Dexter's body was transferred from the coroner's SUV to the funeral home's van, Betterson stared blankly into the black bag holding her son's remains and asked, why couldn't they have at least buried him in a box? Unquote. And so that again, this is happening now, today, right? Like, there are still how many bodies in that field that are just marked with a sign with a number? How many of those people's family members have no idea where they are? Like, I can only say it so many times. It's still happening. Racism is still an issue today. You know, I've been teaching these English comp classes, right? I do the English Composition 1, so the first entry-level college English. So all new students have to take it unless they've taken it, previously. And one of the first essays that I have them write is a narrative essay. And for our program in our English department, I have the creative liberty to choose the subject of the narrative essay. So like, it's set in our curriculum that it has to be a narrative essay, and there's a certain, different educational goals and learning objectives that have to be met with this essay. But otherwise, topic-wise, I have the ability to choose that. And they have a few, I think for the narrative ones, it's 3 or 4 kind of like pre-built options that most teachers commonly use. And so, I have the ability to choose one of those. And one of them is a social and racial justice narrative essay. And I kind of always choose that one for all 3 of the classes now that I've taught, because I love it. And honestly, the students love it too, from the feedback that I've gotten. And also, I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to do content like that with the new Senate bill that just dropped in Ohio. And so I wanted to do it again for this class. And it's heartbreaking because I read these essays, and granted, this is only my third class I've taught at this college. And so that's only about, it'll be around, give or take, 75, 90 students tops, which in the big picture is not that many kids, right? But they all write about any story, person, experience, perspective related to social and or racial justice that has happened to them. And it's really just for them to start writing anything. And so it's very personalized. And I always tell them, I'm like, this is your story, tell your story, right? And so I get these essays back and I read them, and it's heartbreaking to hear their stories, because out of the 75 to 90 kids that we've had so far in these classes, I have only had 2 students actually email me on the side and be like, I don't know what to write about. I've never experienced racial injustice. I've never seen it. I don't know what to write about. I've only had 2 kids do that. And so one of them ended up just writing about, because I gave him, a bunch of ideas, and I'm like, awesome, if you haven't personally experienced it, consider this. Have you seen it? Have you seen other people experience it? And so like the one kid wrote about Jackie Robinson and how, he was really motivational because this kid wanted to play sports. It doesn't matter, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, cool, that works. Awesome. Because it's still, an inspiring perspective and story and whatever. Like, it gets the point across. And then I had the other kid, the second one, wrote about how she stood up for her religion because people were like, hey, this is kind of concerning. Are you okay? And she was like, no, I'm not giving up my faith. And so I'm like, okay, cool. Like, that's like a form, religious injustice is also a form of social injustice. So like that, that works. But otherwise, every other student that I've had with this essay has had something pretty significant and substantial happen in their lives, either to them, to their parents, to their siblings, that was like very astounding. Like, I had one girl, and it was so sweet because she was like, thank you so much for letting me write this essay. I didn't realize how much I was holding on to it and how much it bothered me until I wrote about it. And I feel so much better now just getting my story out there. But she wrote about how some coworkers at like Jamba Juice, wherever, she's from Hawaii, and one of her coworkers called her an island N-word. And she was like, I don't like that. Like, that's not cool. Hate that. And then the coworker was like, no, why are you being so sensitive? Like, ha ha ha, it's just a funny joke. Like, it's fine. And then I think she ended up actually getting that person fired, which is, great. And it's crazy to hear some of the experiences that these kids are having. I think sometimes we get a little, especially if you're white, if you're privileged, like, you get a little sheltered and you think, it's not happening. It's not that big of an issue. It's not that serious. But I think we're just getting more and more removed from people that it is actually affecting. We're not hearing their stories. And so then when you don't hear the stories, it effectually doesn't exist. We're not seeing these things on the news about unmarked graves. And, we're not hearing all of these insane things that are happening around our country. And it's so sad because you go all the way back over 100 years ago, 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacres. And all of these stories have the same thing in common. We're seeing the same threads over and over and over again. Prejudice, unfair treatment, and just straight up hate. And depending on where you were raised, when you grew up, if you were, your background, all that stuff, I feel like if you were asked, when did racism end in America? I feel like you would get a variety of answers. Some would automatically say 1865 with Lincoln. Some would say Juneteenth. Some would maybe say Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Maybe Civil Rights Act, 1964. Maybe the final overturning of Jim Crow laws in 1965. I would argue that there is no correct answer to that question because racism hasn't ended in America yet. It's still prevalent. You ask any of my students in my English comp class at a tiny little local community college, the majority of them have experiences, first-hand experiences with racial inequality and prejudice and hate and racism. You look across the board anywhere in our country at almost any marginalized group of people, they're experiencing hate, they are experiencing prejudice. It's still happening. It still exists. And like I said, I'm concerned that we're going backwards with our policies, the educational systems, the workforces, like literally by removing the ability to talk about diversity, inclusion, equity, women, any of those things that are just banned now, like, taboo words, you can't say them, you gotta white them out. It's insane. And, I look back at that Travis article with the reasons why the Equal Opportunity Office was even established. And ironically enough, at my work unit, they had to pull all of the posters for the Equal Opportunity Office and the phone numbers and the websites and the help resources for the airmen because that is considered DEI. And so I'm like, okay, so who do you want these airmen to go to when they are experiencing inequality and unfair treatment, racial prejudice? Who are they supposed to reach out to? That office is literally established to help them if they are getting unfair treatment. Who do they go to now? I don't know. I'm like, don't ask me the question because I don't know the answer. I don't know the correct answer. I just feel like we're reverting back to the very, very tense social dynamics of the 50s and the 60s. And it sucks because I think we're just going to see more violence and then that will get pushed back onto them, just like with the Black Lives Matter movements, with those protests where it got flipped on them and they were like, oh, it was just fuel for white people on the news anchors and stuff. And they were like, oh, look how uncivilized and aggressive. They're so angry and they're so violent and so explosive and unpredictable. They're savages. Protect the women and children from them. Clutch your pearls for safety. Like, they flip it around and it sucks because their anger is justified. But it's like it's just like, honestly, women in leadership positions. You show the slightest amount of emotion and then it gets twisted back onto you, blown out of proportion. Be like, well, this is why women can't be leaders because you're just too emotional. You can't think rationally. You can't think logically. You're so emotional. And it's like, no, you're just frustrating because you're so close-minded. You're so dumb, And it's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. But all we can do is do better than we did the day before, right? That's all we can hope to do. Share these stories because we have to know our history. I feel like we can't stress it enough. We have to know our history in order to not keep repeating our history. And I also think we have to listen to the history and listen to the uncomfortable history to remember that, yes, this did actually happen. This does actually exist. Because otherwise we're too removed from it. It's not personal enough if you don't see pictures and hear their voices and read their names. It's not real, unfortunately. If it's not directly impacting us, I feel like humanity as a whole, we are quick to just kind of blow it off and brush it aside and be like, oh, well, like, it's not that big of a deal, right? Like, I would have heard about it otherwise. It's not that serious. But it is. It's just that information is not getting to us. It's not. So with that, I will wrap up this very long episode. Sorry. Make good choices. Be a decent human being. Take care of each other. Listen to other people's stories. Don't erase their history. Have those difficult conversations. And I will catch you all next time. Okay, bye.